Paul Muni had been feeling watched for 3 days now, though he couldn't identify the source of his unease. It was nothing he could point to, no faces that appeared too frequently, no cars that lingered too long outside his Beverly Hills home. Just a persistent sensation that someone, somewhere, was paying attention to him in ways that went beyond normal Hollywood curiosity. The feeling had started as a whisper at the back of his mind and grown into something that made him check his rearview mirror more often than usual, made him pause before answering his telephone. He found himself wondering if this was what it felt like to be prey. Now, standing before a mirror in his dressing room at Paramount Studios, he tried to focus on the immediate task at hand, but the sensation of invisible scrutiny remained. The summer heat of 1,930 pressed down on stage 7 like a heavy curtain, and Muni studied his reflection with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The putty on his nose had been shaped and reshaped 4 times that morning. The scar tissue applied to his left cheek still didn't sit quite right. "It's not enough," he muttered, peeling away another layer of makeup. His assistant, Eddie Morse, watched nervously from the corner. "Mr. Muni, we've been at this for 3 hours. Mr. Hawks is waiting on set." Muni ignored him. He picked up a photograph from his dressing table, a newspaper clipping, showing a stocky man in an expensive overcoat stepping out of a Chicago courthouse. The man's face was round, his expression neither threatening nor particularly memorable. Just another businessman, if you didn't know better. But Paul Muni knew better. Everyone in Hollywood knew better. The man in the photograph was Alphonse Capone, and Muni was preparing to bring him to life on screen in a film being produced through a complex arrangement between Howard Hughes and director Howard Hawks, using rented space at Paramount, not officially based on Capone, of course. The studio lawyers had been very clear about that. The character's name would be Tony Camonte. The setting would be deliberately vague, but everyone understood what they were really making. "Eddie," Muni said finally, setting down the photograph, "do you know what my greatest fear is? The picture not being a hit?" Muni shook his head. "My fear is that I'll turn a real man into a cartoon, that I'll make people laugh when they should be thinking, that I'll show them a monster when what they need to see is a human being who became something terrible." For 3 months, Muni had haunted Chicago's South Side, researching his role in ways that went far beyond reading newspaper accounts. He had learned to make himself invisible in speakeasies where conversations died when strangers appeared. One evening, sitting in a diner near the South Loop, he had watched 2 men at the next table receive a phone call. The caller spoke only 3 words that Muni could hear: "He's not pleased." Both men went pale, left money on the table, and walked out without finishing their meals. The waitress, cleaning their table, had whispered to another customer, "3rd time this week someone's gotten that kind of call." Most importantly, Muni had learned that the real Alphonse Capone was nothing like what people expected. The man who controlled Chicago was not a raging beast or theatrical villain, but something far more unsettling, a strategist who understood that effective power rarely needed to announce itself. Director Howard Hawks entered the dressing room without knocking, a habit that would have irritated most actors, but which Muni had come to expect. "Ready, Paul?" "No," Muni replied honestly. "I don't think anyone can be ready for this." Hawks studied him for a moment. "The executives are getting nervous. Hughes is asking daily questions about our progress. They should be nervous. Paul, if you want to withdraw from the picture—" "No," Muni's voice was firm. "This story needs to be told, but it needs to be told right." What neither man could have predicted was that their conversation was not taking place in a vacuum. In Chicago, the first ripples of awareness were already beginning to spread through networks that operated on information and influence, rather than official channels. The Palmer House Hotel's lobby buzzed with its usual afternoon energy when Johnny Torrio, now living a quieter life but still connected to the city's unofficial power structure, noticed a small item buried in the entertainment section of the Chicago Tribune. Most readers would have skipped past the brief mention of a new gangster picture entering production in Hollywood. But Torrio understood that in their world, even small stories could have large consequences. He made a phone call that evening, speaking carefully to someone who would pass the information along appropriate channels. No instructions were given, no demands made. Simply information shared among people who understood its potential significance. 3 days later, a man named Vincent Torino, who introduced himself as representing certain Chicago business interests, placed a call to the offices of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association in New York. "Mr. Hayes?" Torino said to the organization's president, Will Hayes. "I understand there's a picture being made about Chicago business practices. We're concerned about accuracy." Hayes, a former postmaster general who had built his career on understanding political currents, listened carefully. "What specific concerns do you have, Mr. Torino?" "We wouldn't want audiences to get the wrong impression about legitimate businessmen. Perhaps your office could review the script to ensure it meets appropriate standards?" The conversation was brief and polite. No threats were made, no consequences outlined. But Hayes understood the language of influence well enough to recognize a request that was not really a request. Within a week, the Hayes office had contacted Howard Hughes about reviewing the Scarface screenplay for potential moral objections. The review process, they explained, might require certain modifications to ensure the film met community standards. Back in Hollywood, Paul Muni was discovering that authenticity came with unexpected costs. His research into Capone's world had begun to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The screenplay by Ben Hecht had originally been a work of brutal honesty, but as filming progressed, subtle changes started appearing. A scene showing police corruption was modified to emphasize the criminal's villainy instead. Dialogue that implicated city officials was rewritten to focus on mob violence. "It's the lawyers," producer Howard Hughes explained during a production meeting. "They're concerned about libel issues." But Muni sensed something else. The changes weren't random legal protections, they followed a pattern, making the gangster character more theatrical, more obviously villainous, less like a real person who might exist in the real world. The first concrete sign of external pressure came when Lowe's theater chain, which had initially expressed enthusiasm about booking the film, suddenly requested a meeting to discuss concerns about community reaction. "Mr. Hughes," the Lowe's representative said during a tense conference call, "we've been hearing from some of our Chicago exhibitors. They're worried about potential complications." "What kind of complications?" Hughes asked. "The kind that affect business, insurance, permits, you understand." The complications became real when the Chicago Tribune's entertainment editor called Hawks directly. "Howard, I'm sorry, but we're pulling the feature story we planned about your production." "May I ask why?" "Editorial decision. Sometimes timing isn't right for certain subjects. You understand." Hawks understood perfectly. The story had been scheduled to run with photographs from the set and interviews with the cast. Its cancellation meant the film was losing a significant promotional opportunity in one of its most important markets. Similar conversations began occurring with increasing frequency. An advertising agency that had been developing promotional materials called to explain they were reconsidering their involvement due to potential controversy. Most disturbing was a meeting Hughes attended with representatives from the film's insurance company, who sat in a stark conference room reviewing actuarial tables that seemed to apply to more than standard production risks. "Mr. Hughes," the lead underwriter said, "we're concerned about potential incidents that might occur during or after the film's release. Our Chicago office has advised us that certain elements of the business community are taking an unusually keen interest in this production." "Are you saying you won't insure the film?" "We're saying our rates may need to reflect the unique risk profile of this particular subject matter." The premium increase was substantial enough to force budget reconsiderations throughout the production. That evening, Muni received a phone call at his Beverly Hills home. The caller identified himself as representing a Chicago business association. "Mr. Muni, I understand you're working on a picture about Chicago businessmen." "It's a fictional story," Muni replied carefully. "Of course. Fiction. We appreciate that. We were wondering if you might be interested in meeting with some actual Chicago businessmen for research purposes, to ensure accuracy." The voice was cultured, professional. "Tomorrow evening, if you're available. The Ambassador Hotel, room 1247. "What kind of meeting?" "Nothing formal. Just a conversation between professionals who appreciate good work." The line went dead before Muni could respond. He spent that night walking the grounds of his estate, trying to understand what was happening. No threats had been made, no demands issued. But the invitation felt more ominous than any explicit warning could have been. The next evening, Muni found himself standing outside room 1247 at the Ambassador Hotel. He had told no one about the meeting, not Hawks, not his agent, not even his wife. Some instinct told him this was something he needed to face alone. He knocked twice, softly. The door opened to reveal a well-dressed man of about 45, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. "Mr. Muni," the man said, "I'm Vincent Torino. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." The hotel room was elegant but unremarkable. Torino gestured to one of two chairs arranged facing each other, with a side table bearing coffee service. "I hope you don't mind the informality," Torino said, pouring coffee. "I find that important conversations are often most productive in comfortable surroundings." Muni accepted the coffee but didn't drink. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where we understand each other clearly. You see, Mr. Muni, the people I represent have great respect for the motion picture industry. The power to shape how Americans see themselves and their neighbors, that's a remarkable responsibility." Torino's voice carried the authority of someone speaking for interests larger than himself. "I'm told you're a methodical actor, that you research your roles thoroughly. I try to understand the people I portray." "Understanding?" "Yes." Torino leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, in your research, what did you conclude about the nature of business in Chicago?" The question hung in the air like a trap. If Muni answered honestly about corruption and violence, he would be admitting to planning an attack on legitimate businessmen. If he claimed to have found nothing problematic, he would be lying to someone who clearly knew better. "I concluded that business relationships in Chicago are complex." "Complex. That's diplomatic." Torino smiled thinly. "Mr. Muni, let me pose a different question. What happens to a film that succeeds too well at portraying certain subjects?" "Another impossible trap. Success would mean wider attention, deeper scrutiny, more complications." "And what happens," Torino continued, "to a film that fails to meet expectations?" that disappoints audiences, critics, the people who invested in it. Muni realized, with growing dread, that Torino was systematically removing every safe option. Success would create one kind of problem. Failure would create another. There is, however, a third possibility, Torino said, setting down his cup with deliberate precision. A film that succeeds commercially while remaining uncomplicated. Entertainment that doesn't raise questions it cannot answer. Are you asking me to give a poor performance? I'm asking you to consider what kind of performance would serve everyone's interests best, including your own. The two men sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Torino stood. Mr. Muni, I want you to know that no one has any intention of interfering with your artistic work. Artists should be free to create. But wise artists understand that all choices have consequences, and the wisest choices are often the ones that create the fewest complications for everyone involved. He moved toward the door, then turned back. You might find it interesting to know that the most successful people in any field are those who understand that true strength comes not from confrontation, but from making sure that confrontation never becomes necessary. After Torino left, Muni sat alone in the hotel room for a long time, understanding that he had just experienced something more sophisticated and frightening than any direct threat could have been. Production on Scarface continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The script continued evolving as producers, distributors, and theater owners made their own decisions about acceptable risks. Where the screenplay had once shown a complex man operating in a complex world, it now depicted a clearer villain in a morally simpler universe. Muni found himself caught between artistic integrity and practical reality. The film that was emerging bore less resemblance to Ben Hecht's original vision, but it was still a film that could be completed and released. They want us to add a subtitle, Hawks told Muni one morning. Something about how the story condemns organized crime and supports law enforcement. What did you tell them? I told them we'd consider it. But both men understood that consideration was rapidly becoming acceptance. 3 weeks before the scheduled premiere, Hawks called Muni to his office. Paul, I want you to be prepared for changes to the final cut. They're talking about adding scenes to make it clear that crime doesn't pay. Muni stared at his director. Howard, if we do that, we'll have made exactly the kind of picture I was trying to avoid. Sometimes, the choice isn't between good and perfect, Paul. Sometimes, it's between flawed and non-existent. The premiere of Scarface took place at the Rivoli Theater in New York City on the 9th of April, 1932. Despite all the behind-the-scenes turmoil, Muni's performance retained much of its original power, showing a man whose moral corruption was gradual and believable rather than melodramatic. Hollywood held its collective breath that night, waiting to see what would happen next. In the theater lobby, conversations were muted, with industry executives glancing toward the exits as if expecting uninvited guests. The normal celebration of a major film opening was replaced by nervous anticipation. Every shadow seemed to contain a watching figure. Every unrecognized face in the crowd drew whispered speculation. I keep expecting to see faces I recognize, one distributor whispered to his companion, adjusting his bow tie for the third time in 5 minutes. Maybe that's the point, came the reply. Maybe not knowing is worse than knowing. The evening passed without incident, but the absence of any reaction felt more ominous than a confrontation would have been. The silence of those who might have objected carried its own message. Theater owners reported unusual activity in the weeks that followed, men in expensive suits attending screenings and taking notes. Nothing threatening, nothing overt, just observation. But in a business built on perception, Being watched was sometimes worse than being attacked. 2 months after the premiere, Paul Muni was working in his garden when his housekeeper informed him that he had a visitor. He found a man in his living room examining a book of art reproductions. The visitor was stockier than Vincent Torino, with a rounder face and more expensive clothes. When he looked up, Muni recognized him immediately from the newspaper photograph in his dressing room. Alphonse Capone's presence filled the room in a way that made the elegant furniture seem fragile. He wore a dark suit that fit perfectly, and his movements carried the careful precision of someone who understood that every gesture was observed and interpreted. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Capone said without preamble, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I was in Los Angeles on business." Muni's wife was visiting relatives in New York. The housekeeper had been given the afternoon off. They were alone. "I wanted to discuss your picture," Capone continued, setting the book aside with deliberate care. "I understand it's been quite successful." The statement felt like an accusation. Muni waited, understanding that his response might determine the direction of whatever was about to happen. "I saw it twice," Capone said. "Once at a private screening, once at a regular theater. I wanted to observe audience reactions." "And what did you observe?" Capone was quiet for a long time, studying Muni with the same intensity Muni had brought to studying the photograph. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "I observed that you made a choice, Mr. Muni. You could have portrayed someone like me as a monster. You could have made audiences laugh at me or fear me in simple ways. Instead, you showed them something more complicated." Something in Capone's tone shifted, becoming less formal, though no less controlled. "You showed them a man who makes choices, and how those choices change him. You didn't excuse the choices, but you didn't pretend they were made by someone who wasn't human." Muni found his voice. "Is that acceptable to you? Mr. Muni, do you know what real power looks like?" "I'm not sure I understand." "Real power isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about making them understand you." Capone moved closer to the window. "Your picture shows someone who demands respect through violence. But you also show why that approach ultimately fails. The character becomes isolated, paranoid, destroyed by his own methods." He turned back to face Muni. "That's not a flattering portrait, but it's an honest one. And honesty, Mr. Muni, is something I can respect, even when it's inconvenient." "So, you're not concerned about how you might be seen?" For the first time, Capone smiled, and the expression was more unsettling than his earlier seriousness. "Anyone who watched that picture and thought it was glamorizing my way of life wasn't paying attention. You showed them the cost, the loneliness, the constant suspicion, the way violence becomes a prison for the person who uses it." Capone moved toward the door, then paused. "I want to thank you for not making me into a cartoon. In a world where most people prefer simple stories, you chose to tell a more complicated truth. That takes a particular kind of courage. But you're still here," Muni said quietly, "in my home, making sure I know you noticed." Capone's smile widened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Muni, I am. Because the most important thing for an artist to understand is that someone is always watching. Someone is always paying attention. The question is whether that attention becomes a problem or remains simply awareness." After Capone left, Muni sat in his living room for a long time, understanding that he had experienced something more complex than either threat or absolution. He had been praised for his work, but he had also been marked as someone worthy of personal attention from one of the most dangerous men in America. The approval carried its own weight, its own implications. He realized that he would never again be able to work without wondering who might be watching, who might be taking notes, who might decide that his next choice required a personal visit. The praise felt like a sentence as much as a commendation. Years later, Paul Muni came to understand that the real story was not about gangsters and movie stars, but about influence itself. No one had ever threatened him directly or demanded specific changes. Instead, a network of intermediaries had simply made their concerns known, allowing industry professionals to make their own decisions about acceptable risks. The most unsettling aspect was not that power had been exercised, but how little it had needed to be. The possibility of displeasure had been sufficient to transform an entire project, as people throughout the industry chose caution over confrontation. Scarface was released and stands today as a significant achievement in cinema. But the story of its creation revealed something about America that no crime film could capture: that the most effective influence often operates through suggestion rather than force, through the quiet adjustment of possibilities rather than dramatic ultimatums. This account represents a dramatized exploration of the pressures that may have surrounded such productions during an era when the boundaries between different forms of American power were often deliberately obscured.